Good afternoon. My name is Scott Settelmyer. I'm the managing director for TerraCarbon. You can read about TerraCarbon in the speaker bios, but basically we're a consulting firm. We support the development of carbon projects in the land use sector, so-called nature-based climate solutions. So we work on forests, we work on grasslands, agricultural lands, and also coastal wetlands. So we joined the BWM2 project to look at the feasibility of developing a carbon offset project around the restoration activities at Herring River. And I'm just going to share with you some of the highlights from that study. Just from a structure standpoint, we divided, or we looked at the feasibility of carbon project across these 5 areas, starting with market, technical, financial analysis, and then also look at some of the legal and organizational issues. And I'll give you a quick highlights from each of these. The questions that we were seeking to answer in each of these areas, in the market area, was to answer whether the project was eligible in the regulatory or voluntary market, and what sort of prices could we expect from carbon offsets that could be sold in these markets. From a technical perspective, we wanted to know, was the project eligible to use this new methodology that was developed by this project for tidal wetland restoration? There's certain applicability conditions. It's not applicable to every restoration, so we wanted to look at that in more detail. And we wanted to importantly estimate how many credits could be generated in the carbon market by applying this methodology and incorporating all the science and all the data that has been generated from this project. From the financial perspective, then, we wanted to understand how much, what are the sort of revenues that could be generated from the sale of those offsets, and then what were some of the associated costs for the carbon project that we would also need to consider related to the registration of the project and ongoing monitoring activities. On the legal side, the main questions that we wanted to answer are who owns the carbon rights from this restoration, and can they be transferred? I think Tim talked about that and some of the work that the National Park Service is doing right now to look at that, but I'll add a few comments to that as well. And on the organizational side, we wanted to look at really the anatomy of a carbon project and which kind of organizations needed to be involved throughout that carbon project, and was there capacity in place on the ground to actually make this happen at Herring River. Okay, so to start with the market findings, the Herring River Restoration Project would be eligible to generate offsets in the voluntary carbon market. When we talk about the voluntary carbon market, we distinguish that from the regulatory carbon market. So buyers of carbon offsets in the voluntary market, they're often large companies with voluntary climate commitments, so commitments to reduce or completely eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. We also have regulatory markets. Primarily, the sort of largest one we have in the US is in California, where they have regulatory requirements to reduce their emissions. Offsets are part of that, and I'll talk about that more in a few bullets. In the voluntary market, though, an offset is not an offset, or what do they say? You know, not all offsets are made equal. So what I mean is that there's more, as we've been saying all along, this is not just about the climate mitigation value. There are a whole host of other co-benefits, as we call them, in the carbon market that are really, could be the main benefits for people at Herring River related to the other environmental and community benefits of the project in terms of water quality, habitat, et cetera. So for carbon offset buyers, the blue carbon is in a really unique position. I think a lot of companies understand that there's a certain amount of climate change built in the system already. So mitigation, reducing emissions is really important, but adapting to climate change is also very important. And blue carbon is at that unique intersection where it helps mitigate, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it also helps build climate resiliency. So buyers are pretty interested in this type of project. We've been talking about blue carbon for a couple of years now, and they're pretty interested. Where do I buy these? So we think they'll be pretty attractive in the voluntary market. Prices in the voluntary market, again, they do vary based on the project type and the co-benefits. And I should also say, each buyer will value those co-benefits and the location of those projects in a different way. So we see a wide range of prices in the voluntary carbon market for land-based offsets, anywhere from $4 to $10 a ton. We think probably the blue carbon projects and blue carbon offsets like Herring River should be trading at the higher end. We'll be able to sell at the higher end of that range. And then to come back to regulatory markets, and there was a side conversation earlier today about this. At the moment, tidal wetland restoration is not an eligible project type in the California regulatory system to generate offsets. That's largely because it's a new, tidal wetland restoration is new to the carbon markets. It's sort of 2.0 of the carbon markets, where 1.0 was forests. And so we don't have a lot of demonstration projects yet. And so projects like Herring River can be really valuable in demonstrating that we can quantify reliably the greenhouse gas benefits of these projects. And once we have some demonstration projects, then that door to have that discussion with the regulators in California and other states that adopt these types of programs, it starts to open. And just for reference, those prices are quite good. They're around $12 a ton currently for offsets, and that market is really vibrant. There's a lot of demand. Sellers are able to sell offsets right away, which in the voluntary market, they have to work a little bit harder to find the right buyer who's well-suited to that project. So it's, I think, something sort of an ambition for the future. Okay, on the technical side, here are some of the main findings. First, that the restoration project, the area and the activities that are planned as part of the Herring River Restoration Project all would meet the applicability conditions of this methodology that has been developed under the Verified Carbon Standard. So the good news is there is a methodology that we can apply that could be used to register the project. This has been talked about already this morning, the key greenhouse gas pools. When you're thinking about carbon offset generation and greenhouse gas benefits, they're soil carbon, soil methane, and biomass, and largely related to some of the tree biomass that has evolved there since it's been drained. So we have to look at that too. What we did is we developed a range of emission reduction estimates using the field data that you heard about this morning, and also supplemented by some literature, because the field data is still somewhat limited in some of the areas, some of the vegetation types that we see in Herring River. Tim talked about, I think maybe even showed a slide here, but this shows you the land cover classes in the Herring River in what we call the baseline, and just a nod to some of Kevin's earlier comments. The baseline, this really reflects sort of current, what you see out there in the landscape today. It doesn't incorporate what are these projected changes if we do nothing and the water table rises and there's already a vegetation change. That's an important sort of part of maybe some follow-on work. But that represents the current land use you see at Herring River. And we looked at two different with project or two restoration scenarios. Tim referred to those earlier. But in this scenario, you can see those areas of non-tidal wooded swamp, scrub shrub, fresh emergent marsh get replaced with salt marsh and tidal flat in that project scenario one. And there's a second scenario where that tidal flat is managed more actively and becomes salt marsh habitat. And so that's the second scenario that we looked at as well. And for each of these different land use types, we had different soil carbon, soil methane, and biomass carbon assumptions. Those assumptions, as I said before, there's still some variability in those data in terms of the GHG emissions. And also some, we varied the amount of project area that I just mentioned in terms of the salt marsh area increasing in the more managed project scenario too. And we came up with these low, mid, and high estimates of greenhouse gas reductions. And we did this over a 40-year time frame. I think we saw this morning some 100-year projections. We did it over, I guess, a shorter time frame to look at, maybe more relevant to the financing component. And you can see the sort of different contributions of each pool to the net result. And I guess the big thing that stands out for me in this graph, well, two things. In the high scenario, you can see that the soil carbon potential is much greater because we're more actively managing that tidal flat to become a salt marsh, and so that's having a pretty big impact. But really the big thing that I see is that the methane potential, that red bar, there's quite a big range. You can see from low to mid to high, and that reflects, I think, a lot of the comments this morning about the uncertainty that we have still around methane in the baseline in these drained areas where the data is still pretty thin. So and in literature, the methane emissions are highly variable in low salinity systems. So these estimates reflect that high variability that we still have. So this gives you a little better idea how those emission reductions build up over time. So this is the numbers you saw before at the end of 40 years. Really, what this, just to speak real briefly to the trees that are, that have established themselves there, these upland areas that will most likely die off in a reconnection scenario. And so, they're a drag, a small drag, but they're a drag on the emission reductions. We have to account for all the fluxes from the project activity. So if we lose carbon in the trees, we have to account for that as a loss here. And you can see in the low scenario, we almost don't overcome that. In the high scenario, we turn positive in year 4 or year 5. And in the mid scenario, around year 10 or 11, the net balance, the cumulative balance is positive. We've overcome those emissions of biomass that we conservatively assume occur immediately. I will make one other comment. Tim mentioned about we don't know exactly how fast the restoration would progress. We're not going to open up all the floodgates immediately. So in our modeling, we assumed it would occur gradually over 10 years. So 1/10 sort of that land gets restored each year for 10 years. A simplifying assumption, but these are the estimates then of the carbon credits that could be generated. You can see in this low scenario where we have very low methane in the baseline, We have a low number of credits that get generated. Our sort of base case or mid case is that middle one of 85,000 tons, and in the high scenario, quite, getting to be quite significant, 300,000 tons and I think, yeah, and these are, I guess, the same numbers, and you can see the car equivalents if you think more in terms of that. So, 18,000 cars off the road for 1 year in the mid-case scenario. So here's the financial analysis of all of that. So we know how many offsets we have projections of these offsets. So what are the projections of revenues and expenses related to this carbon project? And so, from a cost standpoint, you should know that carbon projects have to, there's a pretty rigorous process to apply that methodology that we've been talking about and pull together all the analysis and documentation to apply that methodology. That goes through a third-party audit process, which can be quite expensive as well. And then on a periodic basis, we assume every 5 years, there would be the project would be monitored. So there would be field data or other data collected, and we would quantify the emission reductions that have occurred since the beginning of the project. That, too, goes through an audit process. So this is part of the carbon market being very rigorous to ensure that the buyers, when they receive an offset, they know that it's been, a sort of rigorous methodology has been applied, it's been checked, it's been third-party audited, and that they can have faith that it represents a real ton of greenhouse gas emission reduction. That has a cost to it, and that cost over those 40 years is that red bar below there. In today's dollars, just under $1 million over the 40 years is what we estimated. And then the blue bars, of course, are the revenues. So the offset, that's basically the offset projections that we showed on the last slide. And we applied some price estimates, low, mid, and high estimates of $5, $10, and $15 a ton, which are roughly, as I said, sort of the $5 to $10 ton range is where we see the market today. The high range of $15 a ton is not far off where we see the compliance market. And I think, actually we did some other analysis here, which I think is, when you think about this project over the longer term, over 40 years, is relevant, because I think our hope is that we're not still in a $5 to $10 voluntary carbon market in 10 or 20 years from now. Hopefully we're transitioning to compliance markets with higher prices. So we looked at higher prices above that, $20 a ton, $40 a ton. And just for reference, for a benchmark, $40 a ton is the price that a lot of economists say is the necessary carbon price to incentivize greenhouse gas emission reductions so that we can hit the global targets that have been set. It also happens to be the price of some recent proposals at the federal level on carbon taxes, $40 a ton. So it's not really a far-fetched number. And you can see, if you think back to this slide right here, when we have increasing, the expenses are relatively fixed. So when we increase carbon prices from 10 to 15 and 15 to 20, that's all incremental revenue and cash flow to the project. So that has a big benefit to the project. Okay, so finally, last two, legal. Tim talked about the National Park Service, looking at can a project occur on federal lands, and how would that generate offsets, and what would be the parameters around doing a project. The good news is there are precedent transactions within the Department of Interior. At the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they've done a number of carbon projects dating back to the mid-2000s on National Wildlife Refuge land. They're hosting a number of voluntary forest carbon projects, but it's a different agency within Interior, and so different process to go through. And as Tim also mentioned, we have the whole project area isn't just National Park Service land. There are other landowners, including private landowners, some businesses, commercial municipality owners. So there is a way for the project to be designed so that all of those landowners could be added, maybe not all at the same time, but incrementally over time could join the carbon project and basically leverage those costs that we said. So instead of multiplying them out and everybody doing their own project, we leverage those costs in one time and we add landowners. So I think that's something really promising to think about. It's important to get to a sufficient scale because those costs that we looked at before are more or less the same whether you're at 600 acres or 1,000 acres or 2,000 acres, So, but the revenues obviously scale according to the acreage. So it's important to try to get to sort of a critical mass. 1,000 acres is probably at least what the project needs to be, but it can happen over time. And so the last segment or last part of the feasibility that we looked at was the organizational aspects. And this is, I talked about the anatomy of a carbon project. And so, this sort of middle box here, project proponent, sort of start from that point. And in a carbon market, a project proponent is the organization that registers the carbon project with carbon registry and receives the carbon offsets from the project. And so, and then can sell those offsets to a funding partner and in return, generate funding. These two are reversed here, by the way. So that should be dollars coming, carbon offsets going to the funding partner. And they're also the ones that work with the landowners. And there'll be multiple landowners, as we said here, potentially in this project, that would have to transfer their carbon rights to that project proponent for them to actually develop this project and register it. But that project proponent would also be the one working with these other technical partners to go through that whole carbon project process through the registration, ongoing monitoring, and verification. These guys here, this acronym is a validation and verification body, the auditors. So they would be also sort of coordinating all this work to provide data to support the carbon project and issuance of offsets. And also, of course, would be working with the implementation partners who are actually doing the restoration. In the case of the Herring River project, we did a quick look at who are some of the organizations already on the ground who could fulfill some of these roles if a carbon project was developed. And in the middle box here, RAE is Restore America's Estuaries, and that was an example of someone who could serve as a project proponent. And the importance here is that someone like them with the national scale, with access to funding partners, sort of national reach on funding partners, with established relationships with these technical partners who are doing carbon projects, that would put them in a good sort of position and an experienced position to guide this project through the process. Of course, National Park Service and other landowners they would own sort of the carbon rights. Again, these two are reversed. The towns of Wellfleet and Truro, as well as the Friends of Herring River, examples of organizations who are involved on the implementation side that would also potentially be doing, some of the restoration work that they're going to be doing are going to affect, how quickly the restoration occurs, which is going to affect how many carbon offsets are going to be generated. So there's important sort of information and communication that would need to be established there. So that's what it looks like. Organizationally, I think the bottom line is this is a doable. Probably the one missing piece that would still need to get worked out still is who would serve as a project proponent to help bring all these pieces together. So takeaways that I hope you leave today with is that first is that Herring River Restoration Project is eligible under the voluntary offset standards. Prices in the voluntary market do vary, but we'd expect that the offsets from this project could be sold at the higher end of that range, closer to $10 a ton. Our mid-estimate for carbon offset generation over 40 years is around 85,000 tons of CO2, which is equivalent to about 18,000 cars for 1 year. But there's still a large range of outcomes due to the variability in methane and still some scarcity of data that we have to work with. Carbon revenues can cover the carbon costs in our mid and high scenarios and could provide additional funding for things like long-term monitoring. But if grant funding is available to cover some of these costs, even better, and more money to go to some of these other needs. Still need to get Department of Interior approval to move forward to do a carbon offset project. Again, we have multiple landowners. The project can be started with one landowner, can be started on National Park Service land, and could be expanded over time. So finally, in terms of next steps, Tim's already mentioned this is already in process. Department of Interior Council is looking at the carbon issue. I think we've talked today, science team, about some of the science data we have on the greenhouse gas fluxes. I said collect additional methane data in low salinity parts. This is really in the restricted parts of the system so that we could narrow the range of potential outcomes. That would be helpful. There's some additional methane collection that could occur. And, I want to also, again, point out sea level rise modeling and the fact that our baseline today is really conservative because we're assuming it's the status quo. And really, if, based on sort of some of the data that Kevin presented, our baseline could really be sort of increasing groundwater tables, increasing vegetation types like Phragmites that increase methane in the baseline. So, doing not only additional sea level rise modeling, but modeling of what the impact is on vegetation and methane emissions would really be helpful as well. And then if this project were to go forward, I think looking for new sources of grant funding to support some of the carbon project costs. It's a really compelling project. It's a new project. It would, as I said, we're in desperate need of sort of pilot and demonstration projects. I think grant funders like that. And so I think it would be, I think it's apt that we're here in Plymouth and that that we're pioneering something really new. And so I leave it there and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Just a clarification question. When you were doing your paybacks and your high cost, the numbers for high and low amounts that we could get.
Yeah.
Just linking it back on which reduction estimates we're using for that, the high, low, medium.
Well, I guess we did them for all scenarios.
Oh, okay.
Let me see if I can find that real quick. But it was just so we had some different payback periods. I mean, in the low scenario, because the revenue generation is not sufficient to cover costs, those never get paid back. And then the mid scenario is about 35 years, and in the high scenario, you sort of pay back those carbon costs in 10 years. This assumes that these are all out of pocket and they're not funded by any grant.
Okay, but those are high, mid, and high prices.
Right, yeah.
But what were you using for carbon reduction? Because you had like mid.
Well, we were using those were the carbon reductions for each of those scenarios.
So just to clarify, Scott, when it was low, was it low credits and
low prices? Yeah.
So it was all the low stuff, all
Yes.
the medium stuff, and all the high stuff.
You got it.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, which question do I pick first? So I'm curious whether you guys have done any outreach or communication with the other landowners to figure out whether they're more excited about the project because of the potential carbon revenues. Is that helping bring partners on board?
Give it to me.
Take this one.
No, we haven't really plot this out. We haven't really taken this message out to the public really at all, and it would be difficult. There's some skepticism about the project in the local area, so we're for the restoration project overall. So we're trying to be careful about aspects of it that we bring out to the public and being strategic and trying to keep that on a.
And is the skepticism about doing the project in the first place?
Yeah.
The goals of it, or just
There's lots of other things. It's a small group, but they're kind of active and vocal and have the media at their disposal sometimes. So this would be very esoteric to bring out at this point. Yeah. We're having enough trouble within our agencies and things like that at this point. So.
Yeah, so we tried, this is a key part of, how you work with end users and stakeholders. So we tried to kind of really let them be the guide in terms of how the rest of the restoration project is going and when to do that. So we focused our efforts on the Herring River partners and those agencies and the local entities working on that, because since they're spearheading the effort, so they can start integrating that part of the story. And the Friends of Herring River as well. Other questions? Yes.
So this is partly for Kevin, I think, but you described earlier how the groundwater table, if the existing bridge stays in place, how the groundwater table will rise and eventually flood out some of the existing vegetation and turn it into frag. What happens to the groundwater table if you restore the site and remove the dike?
Yeah, good question. I think for the time scale of a few decades, the SLAM modeling that the Park Service has already had done by the Woods Hole Group is probably good representation. Essentially it'll be closer to a natural salt marsh in terms of its relationship to water levels. The groundwater level could reach a natural condition relative to the sea level. Most of what was once salt marsh would then be inundated from the sea rather than inundated by fresh water alone. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Scott, you didn't mention this, and I don't know whether this is relevant, but I know in some environmental markets, you set aside credits that you can't earn because it's there to moderate environmental variability through time, of drought year, of flood year, where things are just really different. Is that part of this analysis in any way, or is it accounted for somewhere?
It is, yeah. Yeah, we didn't necessarily go into that, but these estimates they include that component, and it's a small component because the basic idea is that when you store carbon, like in a forest, you could have a disturbance, like a fire, and that carbon could get re-emitted to the atmosphere, and so there's a set aside that projects in the carbon market set aside some of their credits to protect against that. In this system, where a lot of the benefits are from avoided methane emissions, those are avoided no matter what. And so we only looked at like in terms of that risk with respect to the benefits here that were related to the carbon stocks, which maybe the way to think about it is with respect to the sort of blue-green bars here.
So what you just said is there's actually less risk in this kind of a system
Yeah.
than in a forest.
Well, that's true.
So that feels like another potential selling point that investors might be interested in, right? I mean, that's cool.
Yeah, there's lower risk of that, but I mean it's as you probably know, it's you also on the other hand have to kind of understand in these systems how they respond to sea level rise and if they can perpetuate. Yeah.
I want to give, we're almost out of time, but I do want to give a chance for a question for someone who may be hearing about this story for the very first time. Feasibility, the markets, I know there's someone like that in this room. And so I just wondered if you are in that bucket of hearing about the story, thinking about it for the first time, like what's your first question related to it? Anyone brave enough? Yes.
I'll ask a simple one just to really to clarify the interpretation of this. I'm looking at the fact that you're using cars as an equivalent to measure this, but you're talking about cars for 1 year versus emission reduction over 40 years.
Yeah.
Would it be right to say 18,000 cars over 1 year, that's 1,800 cars over
Or you could divide it by
4 years, so the equivalent is 450 cars for 40 years.
Yeah, if you wanted to divide it by 40
Yeah.
and say it's for 40 years, then you would be right.
So is it also roughly right to say then, because there's about 580 acres of salt marsh been recovered in that period, that about 1.5 acres of salt marsh equals 1 car? In terms of, okay, right, thanks.
I trust Kevin. I didn't. Yeah, you can do these kinds of.
Well, just to clarify, I didn't check your math when I said yeah. Yeah, you can. It is interesting to look at it in an area per car basis. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough. And I see another hand, but I'm going to have to say we have to stop it there just so we get through the rest. And I keep saying, stay for the networking time for more questions. Thank you, Scott and Tim. Thanks again very much.